Hi, it's Dr. Guthrie. We're back again, and we're actually going to do the last book of the Old Testament that we're going to cover. Next week, we'll be covering First Maccabees, which is in my Catholic Bible or in the Apocrypha if you use a Protestant Bible. I'll explain all this in a separate session why we have these different things. But this is Daniel, and Daniel is an interesting book. It's very different. It's what many authors, scholars describe as historical fiction, and it appears to be written about 165 BC, the last book in the Old Testament to be written. Only 165 years to the Christian era starts, and it's a look back type book. It is written there at 165. It purports to be written during the Babylonian exile, which is about 560 at this time, 555. And it's very different. It portrays the writer as writing from the 550 BC era and projecting forward, predicting what's going to happen, as if he's predicting the future, when actually he's looking back from his current time and writing a historical adaptation. And they call it historical fiction because the history isn't that good. He's mixed up a lot of the kings, he's mixed up a lot of the facts, he's mixed up the empires, and it's so it's kind of a mess historically, but that's not the point of it. Excuse me here, I've got my allergies are flaring a little bit. And in 165 was a difficult time in Palestine. I'll go back over the history quickly. The Persians conquered the Babylonian Empire about 535 and let the Jews go home. You guys don't want to go back to Jerusalem? Fine. You want to worship your own God? Fine. Do your own religious rituals? Fine. We don't care. And they were very loyal to the Persians, and they had no complaints with the Persian Empire. The problem was that about 335 BC, along comes Alexander the Great, sweeping out of the Macedonia Greek area, coming rummaging through Turkey, down through Palestine, into Egypt, all the way across Mesopotamia, Iran, Iraq, down into India. And finally his army rebels, and he comes back to Babylon and dies at about age 35 or so. Some people think he had typhoid fever. Nobody really knows. When he dies, he had no succession. His son was not even born until after he died. And so his empire was broken up among four of his generals, one in Greece, one in the northwest Turkey area around where Istanbul is now, and the Mediterranean and the Black Sea coast of that area. One was in Mesopotamia, really up near where the northern Syria, central Iraq, where those major capitals were. And one was down in Egypt. The problem for the Jewish people in Palestine was they were between the two empires, the Seleucids up in Mesopotamia and the Ptolemaic Empire down in Egypt. And when you're in the middle of no man's land between empires, which is really what this was, you have it's bad news, because you get attacked and overrun by both sides. One empire will get stronger, they'll overrun you. That empire will decline, and the next empire will come roaring down on you. You can't win, and you're caught in the middle of this. And so this is putting them in a very difficult situation. The other thing that happened is that the Persians were not intolerant of other people having all their own cultural styles. They had no cultural arrogance or cultural intolerance. They had lots of different people in their empire. And you could worship who you wanted, you could have your religious rights the way you wanted. If you wanted to do this, you wanted to do that. No big deal. Just be loyal to the empire, will take care of you. The Greeks didn't think that way. They thought they had a superior culture, superior civilization, and they expected everybody to adapt to it and to adapt to Greek culture. And it's different than the situation now, where you're finding American culture diffusing across the world. We're not trying to force people in Greece or Japan or whatever to use American culture. They often choose to, plays and music and food and all that. But this was different. The Greeks said you really have to do it their way. Now, the one advantage, which was God using this for when the Christian era started a couple of years later, was that Greek became the universal language of the Eastern Mediterranean, from Greece around through Turkey, down through Lebanon, and even into Egypt. They all spoke Greek as a common language. So when the Christianity started, and Paul and Peter and the apostles could write and speak in Greek, they could use one language to spread the gospel around. So in a strange way, God uses difficult things for his own purpose. So he really did there. But for the Hebrews at the time, culturally, this was really tough. And two things happened. You had one group who jumped into it. They wanted to be Greek and adopt the Greek ways and all this other stuff. And another group called the Hasidim, who wanted to maintain their fundamental Jewishness and maintain Jewish rituals and only worship their own God. For the people who wanted to be Greek, kind of a scary thing, because if you were going into the Greek baths, you had to go in naked. So if you go in naked as a Jewish person, they'll see you were circumcised. Nobody else was circumcised in the area, and they go, ugh. So there were some people who even tried to have their circumcision reversed. I thought, whoa, what a thought. No anesthetic, no pain meds, no antibiotics, no nothing. I don't know what happened to them, but it's not something I would have done. This is a very difficult time for them. And by 165 BC, they have an Antiochus Epiphanes IV, a very, very oppressive king of the Seleucid Empire, and he's very abusive of them. And this is when this book is written, because he's even identified by person as one of the devils in that. So even though it casted its back to the Babylonian Empire and writes it forward, what it's writing is stuff that was already known to the author. Who this author was, he calls himself Daniel. We have no idea who he was, what his background was, anything about it. You just don't know. And the interesting thing about this book is then in the 4th verse of the 2nd chapter through the 7th chapter, the text is in Aramaic, not Hebrew. First part of the text is in Hebrew. From chapter 2, verse 4 through the 7th chapter, it's in Aramaic, which was the other common language at the time, and then it goes back to Hebrew. Why this happened, no one has any idea. Is it a problem? Not to me, but I'm just saying it shows how much we don't know about some of these books, why they were written, who wrote them, and why it would have those two things. Did somebody edit the text? That's what I wonder. That if it was written first in Hebrew and there may have been some problems with it, somebody may have edited it to put their own imprint on it. So, as historical fiction, you can't take this account and say this is what happened. I know this is tough for the literalists, but that's just the way it is. So there's a series of stories in here. And often the kings and dates are wrong. They have various people as king who weren't king, et cetera, et cetera. But there are several romantic stories in the first 6 chapters that, if you were a very avid Sunday school goer like I was when I was a child, I remember some of these stories. There were even some church camp songs about them that I think that I remember singing. I don't remember what the songs were, so I'll spare you having to listen to me do that. In the first one is really in the first chapter, and this is one time at a medical conference, one of the speakers got up and described this as the first recorded medical experiment in human history. I think that's a bit of a stretch, but it's a good stretch. And these were 4 of the youth, Daniel and 3 other Hebrew youths. They were part of the Babylonian Emperor Nebuchadnezzar, one of his household officials, and they're supposed to eat at the table with all this rich food, and they didn't want to. They said, this is not healthy for us. We'd rather have water and eat vegetables. And people are fussing at them because you really had to conform with these people. They didn't tolerate dissent. And so they said, let's have a trial. Let's have a test. For 10 days, you all eat vegetables and drink water, and we'll compare you to the other people who eat the regular diet. And at the end of the 10 days, they look healthier and happier and all that. So this guy said, That's the first medical experience. It's an interesting argument, and it's fun. Having done many, many medical experiments myself, this wouldn't have passed muster. We wouldn't publish it in the journal I had it, but that has to have a little bit of fun. So Daniel becomes part of the imperial court at this point, and he. It's interesting because you see the moving forward, going back to the same customs that you see earlier in the Old Testament, that the talent Joseph had was he could interpret dreams. So in this one, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he can't figure out what it is, and Daniel interprets it for him. I won't go into the interpretation of it. So Daniel becomes a royal official, and that's all well and good, and the king bows down to Yahweh and all that. And then in the next chapter, he builds a big golden statue and makes everybody bow down to it. Well, 3 of the Hebrew boys won't bow down, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so they won't bow down, so they're going to be cast into the furnace and burn up. My memory is when I was in church camp a long, long time ago, that's a long time ago, that was a song about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It may even have been a Sunday school song from 2nd or 3rd grade. I can't remember it, and don't call me up and sing it to me if you do remember it, but I would be interested if anybody remembers it. Maybe I'm making it up. And basically, they had a royal furnace there. I didn't know they had furnaces in 500 BC. And they're going to throw him in the furnace as punishment for refusing to bow down and worship this statue. And so they heat the furnace up to 7 times its normal heat. And how they measure these things, this is why I'm saying it's historical fiction. It's more fantasy. And they take him down there to throw him in the furnace, and they open the door, and the furnace heat kills the royal people escorting these Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Doesn't hurt them, and they go into the furnace. And they can see them walking around in the furnace undamaged by the heat. And there's a 4th person apparition, whatever you want to say, in there with them, and angels in there with them. And after a while, they stop and let them out, and they're unharmed. Miraculous story of going into the fiery furnace. So he has another dream, the king does, and this is about a large tree that gets cut down, and Daniel is asked to interpret it, and he interprets it basically saying that, various other kingdoms will come along, and this one will be destroyed, and these things will happen to you and your followers, et cetera, et cetera. I don't remember all the details of all these things. And he also predicts a variety of things that were bad history. He predicted this king, Nebuchadnezzar, would become insane, which he didn't. There was a different insane king later, but it was a different person, etc. So a lot of the history, when you get into this part, gets really, really weak. And then, but in this dream, you see the appearance of the archangel Gabriel. It's the first time that the concept of an archangel was mentioned. Remember that the understanding of angels and a heavenly court and those things came late to Hebrew, during or after the Babylonian exile, when they got exposed to a lot of Zoroastrian understandings and by the Persians. So this is a very late thing. This is where the concept of an archangel emerges, this very late in the last book in the Old Testament. And then there's another issue where the king gets mad at Daniel. The king forbids anybody from praying to anybody except along his religious lines, and somebody rats out Daniel that he was praying to his own God and not obeying your edict, and the king says, okay, we'll throw him in the lion's den. Apparently they have a den of lions there, pets or zoo or something. And so they throw him in there, and of course God protects him, closes the mouth of the lions, and he's fine. The next day the king gets up, and he's feeling guilty for doing this, and so he goes there and opens it, and Daniel's fine. So they get Daniel out, and the king in revenge gets the royal counselors that wanted Daniel to get eaten and throws them in, and the lions eat them up. Not, again, a nice romantic story, but it doesn't, doesn't have a historical ring to it. And that takes you up to chapter 7. When you get to chapter 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, you have a series of apocalyptic prophecies. Now, let me try to give you an explanation briefly of these fancy theological words. Eschatology is the study and expectation of the end of time. And Jesus actually had a lot of eschatology in his teaching, that our time will end and we'll go on to face the Father and stuff like that. And his end of time could be individual. My time will end, and sometime everybody's time does. And eventually there will be some kind of end. The sun will expand in about 500 million years and burn the earth up or something like that. And then so I saw one program, they said that the universe will go dark. All the stars will burn out in 12 billion years. I'm really not worrying a whole lot about that. And I'll let God will take his rest then finally. That'll be the seventh day and he'll rest. He'll probably just do another big bang, start over. So that's eschatological, and it doesn't have a lot of violence and trauma on it. Apocalyptic literature is a variation of the end of time, but in apocalyptic literature, the end is coming much more immediately. People say, this is going to happen in the next 20 years, these various, and it has a lot of violence. It has a battle between the forces of good, the heavenly forces, and the forces of evil, the devil or the other, Satan or the various forces of evil. And there's this big battle, good always wins, a lot of dead people, and that's apocalyptic. So you got this huge battle. Apocalyptic literature in the New Testament, of course, is Revelation by John of Patmos, and there's this one is apocalyptic in Daniel, and there's a series of books as Ezra and a variety of books in between, written by Jewish authors before the Christian era, that have a lot of apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature is usually written at a time of great stress, where the people to whom you're writing are being abused significantly, and they're feeling that abuse, and they're looking for this kind of divine salvation to come in and destroy their oppressors, destroy their enemies, and free them and let them triumph in the goodness of the heavenly court of the good times produced by God. That happened here when this guy was terribly abusing them in 165. It happened through other parts of the rule by the Greek people. And in when Revelation, the New Testament, was written, it was about 110 AD. And the Romans were just starting to persecute the Christians then. They had not persecuted them before. That's a different question. We won't go into that right now. But that's why it's written then, to say that God will punish these evil Romans, etc. And you have a variety of each chapter. You have a different type of apocalyptic battle, and I have to use my notes here. In chapter 7, it's these four beasts come out, and they have these various, I'm not going to bore you with all these things. In chapter 8, there's a ram and a he-goat, and they go battling each other, and they have these various, and they represent various forces in the world. And one of them represents a new empire coming in to destroy the Babylonian Empire, which was destroyed. And that's where that's where the archangel Gabriel gets really identified in that. In chapter 9, there's again a reference to Gabriel, and there's a death of the anointed one. Now, you got to be careful you don't overread this one. This is not as anointed one, is not a messianic figure. It appears to be referencing one of the high priests of Jerusalem that was murdered by the ruling Greek person. He was anointed as high priest, and he was murdered and therefore martyred, but he was not a messianic figure at that time. Chapter 10, you see another archangel emerge. This is Michael. So the two named archangels we have from the Old Testament are Gabriel and Michael. Those are names we still use, even in modern naming of people in the same. And those are the two archangels that are identified. Chapter 11 describes the dissolution and the destruction of this empire. And it really describes by a different name Alexander the Great coming in and conquering everything. And then his empire being broken up into four, and these various people going at each other. So it's written as if Daniel was predicting this. What actually he's doing is reporting it. And then he ends up focusing on this one Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who describes as wretched. He's a very evil man. He causes much abuse and suffering, et cetera, and even I think he gets murdered along the way, like many evil rulers do. And then chapter 12, you have Archangel Michael appearing again and exacting God's judgment and revenge on all these evil people. So there's when you're actually doing a future prediction. Like I said, I'm not much on apocalyptic literature because it's very difficult to interpret. None of it's ever come true in the 2,000 years we've had these writings. And it's a bit of a danger because you have these in the Holy Scriptures as the inspired word. It allows people who has particular needs emotionally to interpret these their own way and say, God's going to come and destroy the world. And we've had this periodically. It's going to be on Thursday morning, et cetera, and it hasn't happened yet. And it allows people to interpret all sorts of things. So it has a bit of a danger to it. There was a lot of debate in the fourth century about whether to include Revelation in the New Testament or not. And they really struggled with that one. So that takes us up through the part of Revelation. Now, there's some extra chapters in my Catholic Bible, which I won't cover, but that takes it up through this. You can see why it's not my favorite book. I'm not one who gets a lot of motivation from apocalyptic literature. The romantic stories which I remember from my Sunday school youth as the first, second, third grader, of Daniel in the Lion's Den and the people in the furnace and stuff. And I enjoyed the one little story that the guy said was the first medical experiment. But beyond that, you get into these apocalyptic things in which I have great difficulty bonding to it all. So I did the best I can with what I've got here. This takes us through the official Protestant Old Testament. Next week, we're going to do First Maccabees. Now, if you've got a Catholic Bible like I do, it'll be in your Catholic Bible. If you've got a Bible that includes the Apocrypha, a lot of the more modern translations have added the Apocrypha. It'll be in the Apocrypha. If not, maybe look it up online or just wait and we'll do it. First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, and Third Maccabees. First is the only one we're going to read. They actually cover the same period. They are not an easy read. They're difficult, poorly written, and tough to. So I'm not going to make you read Second and Third Maccabees, which really don't add anything. This is really the account of the Maccabean rebellion, which starts about this time, and it's a Jewish revolt against the Greek oppressors, and it's successful. And then we'll cover that period next week, and then I'm going to plunge on into the church history things after that. But it's interesting to wrap up the official Old Testament at this point. It has truly been a pleasure to work with you, and thanks to Eric and Brianna for doing all the taping and posting and all this. This is Dr. Guthrie, First Maccabees next week. Thank you.